Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to an episode of the Coaching and Consulting Insights series on the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Idy Uyoe. Idy is an Olympic scholar and sports marketing specialist. Now, you may recall that Idy helped kick off the second year of Success Insight when he joined us for the episode number 2 in January 2020. After 12 years of delivering value for corporate clients at IBM, Idy decided to pursue his passion for sports, primarily in the areas of marketing, events, and content creation. Idy provides strategic consulting services for global brands, international sports federations, Olympic committees, municipalities, and collegiate bodies. We invited Idy back on the Coaching and Consulting Insight series on Success Insight podcast to chat about the Olympic Games in Tokyo of this year. Now, you'll recall they were postponed in 2020 and they literally just ended this month. So what a perfect time to bring Idy back on the show. Idy, it's a pleasure to have you back on Coaching and Consulting Insights on the Success Insight podcast.
Thank you for having me, Howard. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, as the Olympics were on, I was watching your Facebook post and what you were sharing, and I got to thinking it'd be kind of nice to have you back on the show. And I do appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule, really to chat about the Olympics this year that just ended. I mean, you were on our show again back in January 2020. Who could have guessed the year we were going to have back in 2020? So, just kind of share with us, bring us up to speed what you've been working on, and then let's get into the games that just ended.
Yeah, thank you, Howard. When we last spoke, we had no idea that the world would be radically different, changed by the global pandemic. The Olympics themselves were for the first time ever postponed. Now, there have been 2 cancellations due to World Wars I and II, respectively, but this was the first postponement. And in a world where there is a pandemic, we saw sports kind of go off the radar as brands and event organizers and leagues and governing bodies try to really figure out what to do, since fans were not allowed into stadiums and the Olympics were no exception. And so they were not immune to the uncertainties around the games, hence the postponement of Tokyo, the 2020 Olympic Games to 2021. For me, working with clients was a little bit difficult, primarily due to mobility restrictions. A lot of the work I do requires on-site travel for our consultative engagements, and that was put on hold for the most part. And just like any other business, we had to figure out how to deliver services remotely and try to add value to customers in a manner that did not require on-site visits. So we were able to make that transition. It's not the same, Howard, but still being able to deliver value to clients that need it and require your services in whatever form is still better than not having anything at all. With regard to the Olympics themselves, this was pretty unique because the virus situation in Japan itself was tenuous at best. I mean, the Japanese were really going back and forth with the IOC after the decision had been made in March of 2020 to postpone the Olympics for a year. There was still this back and forth as to whether or not the games would actually hold at all, primarily given the surge of virus in Tokyo. And initially, 80% of the Japanese public said that the games should either be postponed again or they should be canceled altogether. But the powers that be felt that they would be able to deliver a safe Olympic Games, and they decided to move forward. Even up until the last minute being teams had already arrived Tokyo in July, and the venues had been prepped. The organizers within Tokyo themselves said that this thing could still be canceled. So up until the last minute, we weren't quite sure if the games would proceed, despite the fact that athletes had already started arriving in Tokyo.
I seem to recall that, as the athletes were arriving, I mean, there seemed to be some numbers being reported of increases. Is that what you heard or saw, from your perspective?
Yeah, so as athletes were, the incidences within Tokyo within the athletes village and the athletic community itself, athletic community is in games-related cases. Athletes, coaches, members of delegations from the respective countries, those were less than 0.001%, I believe. I think that out of a sample size of 11,000 athletes, coaches, and officials, less than 300, if I have my numbers correctly, tested positive in any kind of way. And there were no fatalities as a result of the COVID-19 virus. So the bubble, if you will, seems largely to have held, though there were some cases. And there were groups that did not even take a chance. For instance, the USA women's gymnastics team opted to stay at a hotel in Tokyo rather than expose the team to the athletes' village, where the protocols from the people I've spoken to while at the games said that the protocols were quite strict, as in submitting to tests at least twice a day. You're on lockdown. You can only arrive at the venues a certain time as a coach with your athletes. So it was a very rigid structure. And I think that for the most part, the Tokyo bubble was able to hold. For me, I will just add a subcontext to this as it relates to the women's gymnastics team. And that is Simone Biles was the, for lack of a better word, the hottest athlete at the Olympics. She had the most focus. She had the most attention coming into the games. And I think that it was a question of not wanting to risk her catching COVID. This is my personal opinion now, that guided the USA gymnastics team to stay at a hotel, because there was just too much riding on it. As in, gymnastics and swimming carry the first week of the Olympic program before the events shift to the stadium during the second week. So when you look at the media and broadcast partners around the world that are designing their programming around Simone Biles and gymnastics, I personally do think that that factored into the decision to eliminate as much risk as possible and take the team to nearby hotels. As far as usually at an Olympic Games, the only people that really do that are the well-established athletes, like the USA men's basketball team, for instance. They would stay in special accommodations away from the athletes' village, if you will, for various reasons. In this case, they took the gymnastics team away from the athletes' village as well, and I think it was a precaution of COVID. And one more sub note to this, once the games started, the Japanese public did rally around the games, primarily because they were unable to attend because the Olympic organizers decided that the venues would be empty, no fans at the venues. So the only people that were at these performing venues were coaches and officials from the various delegations, and that's it. So a lot of the Japanese public had to watch on television, and they did eventually come around to embracing the games. And quite frankly, it took a country as advanced as Japan to be able to pull something like this off.
You know, I'm curious, and I appreciate the rather detailed account of how the games were navigated in this age of COVID. And I was going to ask you, and I appreciate you also answering that, because my question around the viewership in the venue. So they literally were empty except for the teams and their coaches. So there were no spectators at all at any venue?
Yeah, that is correct. The venues in and around Tokyo. Now, at some of the, I don't know if we would really consider this a venue, but like the marathon event was moved to a different city altogether because of weather conditions, et cetera. And you did see people lining the streets for the marathon. But in Tokyo itself, there were no spectators in the venues. Only coaches, officials, and select members of the media. And so the process was very controlled. It was very rigid, if you will, understandably due to COVID. And the athletes post-Olympics talk about the fact that they miss the crowds and they feed off the crowds. That during qualifying for the Olympics, in their respective countries, they did have crowds, even if it wasn't to capacity, at the various competition venues. There were at least crowds there. So they describe an eerie feeling at the stadium, say in a place like swimming, if you will, where, it's a very cavernous sort of venue. And so to hear the echoes and the hollowness of the venue, I think was a bit of a sea change for some of the athletes. So Tokyo officials made the decision early on to allow the venues to be half full. And then they decided right before the games began that there would be no spectators at all.
That had to have been a very hard, yet I would suspect prudent decision, just given the numbers of infections on the rise.
Yes. And I'll also say this. So when I was, one of the countries that I was working with was Kenya, the National Olympic Committee of Kenya. And when I was in Nairobi last year, trying to help them prepare for the games, not just from a branding perspective, but for instance, their camp was supposed to be in a city in Japan for the athletes, the Kenyan athletes, to go and get acclimated to Japan, if you will. So they were supposed to get there in June, camp out for about 28 days before the start of the Olympic Games. And those are some of the casualties of the COVID, in the sense that a lot of these training camps for countries that were supposed to go to other parts of Japan to get acclimated, those plans were scaled down completely. So for instance, in the case of Kenya, only the teams that qualified for the games were allowed to go to these camps, not the individual athletes. So for example, Kenya's rugby team and their volleyball team were allowed to go, but the individual athletes themselves were not allowed to camp, despite the tremendous amount of preparation that these host cities had made for these delegations coming in terms of the economical impact that it would mean for those cities. And a lot of that was now absent because of the pandemic. So a lot of athletes went directly from their home countries to Tokyo right before their events started. So they had to stagger these arrival times in the athletes' village. And once your event was over, you had 48 hours to leave the athletes' village. Whereas in conventional times, you could stay in the athletes' village up to 3 days after the conclusion of the closing ceremonies. So those things were different this time around in Tokyo.
Wow. Is it safe to say that economic-wise, this was a losing proposition through no fault of their own for Japan?
It's hard to say because they really haven't published the hard numbers, but I would say that there were significant cost overruns. And it takes us back to Athens in 2004, which was the first Summer Olympics after 9/11. So basically, the amount of security that was needed, particularly to protect U.S. athletes in terms of moving naval warships off the coast of Greece and all these other things that had to be done to secure the Olympics, blew that budget completely out of the water. We went from $6 billion, which was already about $1 billion over the estimated $5.3 billion that were planned for the games, to a budget very close to $15.3 billion, largely on unplanned, unforeseen security requirements. In this case, I don't think the cost overruns in Tokyo will be that significant, although I do expect a very substantial dent to what was initially planned. For Tokyo, the numbers, again, were somewhere between $5 and $7 billion earmarked for the games. But the experts that I've spoken to say that that number is well north of $20 billion when it's all said and done, due primarily to accommodations that needed to be made as a result of the pandemic, not just at competition venues, but right from the airport. Like the moment you arrive, the testing requirements, the long lines, the additional personnel that they need to hire in order to man these lines and provide testing, then the transportation system that has to be structured a certain way to get people to their respective accommodations. All these things that were not planned and factored into the original Tokyo 2020 budget had to be done as a result of the pandemic. And so, yes, I do expect there to be cost overruns, and it'd be interesting to see what the final numbers look like.
As an Olympic scholar, sports marketing specialist, I mean, your bread and butter in large part depends on you being on site at the venue. And I'm curious how you, or in what ways did you overcome the fact that you couldn't be there to deliver what I know is ultimate value to your clients. How did you accommodate this?
For me, it was a bit difficult in the sense that a lot of the marketing activities that we had been planning since 2018 with some of these Olympic committees, we were unable to do them. An example was, if I could use this, would be tourism Kenya. Kenya wanted to promote and expand its tourism sector, and they wanted to have a Kenya house promoting safaris and some of the other types of tourism areas that they wanted to expand. And so the Olympics was to be a vehicle for doing that. And this was a proposition that, though it had not firmly been concluded, intense studies were made to the cost implications of doing that. Well, with the pandemic, that all went out the window. The best thing that, at best, what some of the clients that I've worked with were doing were having programs where they would showcase and market apparel. If you looked at the opening ceremonies, for instance, of the Kenyan team, it resembled Kenya, the different colors and the vibrance. So those were how some of the clients I work with try to overcome and navigate the inability to have on-site marketing programs at the Olympic Games. So I was in touch with several of the clients trying to figure out what programs, one, were permitted because the Olympics have specific rules around marketing, which, by the way, all those campaigns, if you planned on doing anything marketing related at the Olympic Games, you had to submit these forms and whatever ideas you were doing to the International Olympic Committee on or before March 1st. But once you get to the games, if there are other things that you would like to do, they can make accommodations and exceptions. So we tried the best we could to try to stay engaged with our clients at the games, but it was just very difficult to do anything from a marketing perspective, primarily because you couldn't even leave the athletes' village. You couldn't go really to explore Tokyo. So some of the programs that we would do would involve, in years past, members of the public visiting, say, the Zambian house or the Kenyan house or the Heineken house, if you will. These are hospitality houses that promote and showcase various aspects of a country. All that was absent at these games. So the best we could do was to try to see what we could do that was permissible within the guidelines of A, COVID protocols, and B, what the IOC would permit at these games.
How do you think these games will impact, future games? So in 2024, summer games are going to be in Paris, France. How do you think the Tokyo Games and our reaction and navigating COVID will have an effect on those games or any games in the future for that matter?
Yeah, so the next games in 2024 in Tokyo, the next one after that, 2028, they come back to the U.S., are held in Los Angeles. And 2032 will be in Brisbane, Australia, right near about 20 minutes from the Gold Coast in Australia. So the next three Olympics are already lined up. I can tell you that the 2024 Olympics, officials in Paris are already talking about a very different Olympic experience as a result of COVID. The budgets have already had to be adjusted to accommodate the possibility that a return to quote unquote normal simply won't be possible in the short term. We thought that postponing the Olympics from 2020 to 2021 would mean for the most part that the virus would be behind us. And that's simply not the case. So officials in Paris are doing things to ensure not just the safety of the Olympic community and the public at large, but to the extent that they can forecast what kind of world we will live in at that time and what that would mean to sports and specifically the Olympics, they're trying to make those adjustments now. So it would be interesting to see, as you noted, what ideas are lifted from what could be considered a very successful Tokyo Games and applied to the games in Paris. So that is yet to be seen what kind of adjustments they're going to make, but they've already come out to your question and said that this is a completely different experience that they've had to plan for now, totally away from what they had in mind when the games were awarded to them a few years ago.
Very interesting. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. We've chatted a lot about just the games in general and the reaction and the administration and how the Olympic Committee, the country of Japan, navigated the holding of these games, during this age of COVID. Let's shift gears, if we could, Idy, to the events themselves. I mean, of course, Simone Biles was front and center. The women's soccer team was always on the radar. What are some of the occurrences that stand out for you about this is why Olympics matter? And then let's talk about who some of the, I don't know, for the sake of better words, unsung heroes of the games were the biggest surprises. So let's start with the kind of the events as they played out, or some occurrences. What stood out for you? Because I know, just given your role, you had to watch a lot of Olympics over the course of those weeks.
Yeah, I think right from the beginning with the opening ceremonies, it was a lot more subdued than it has been in years past, primarily because of COVID. And there again, a mostly empty stadium. So that had a surreal feel. But let me start with the marketing elements of the games. Right from the opening ceremonies, the big brands that got involved or extended their footprint in the games. Right as the teams were marching into the stadium during the Parade of Nations, we saw the continuation of big brands like Ralph Lauren outfitting the U.S. Olympic team, if you will, and then the British team being in previous Olympics being kitted by Stella McCartney. That was replaced this year. And the Italian team being outfitted by Giorgio Armani. So being able to see how kits and these marketing, these retail brands, if you will, got involved. HMS, the big retailer out of Sweden, they sponsored the Swedish team. So right from the beginning, it was interesting to watch that during the Parade of Nations. So the other thing that was interesting was that these games had 4 new sports were introduced to the Tokyo Games: the sport of rock climbing, surfing, karate, and skateboarding were added to the Olympic program, and the return of baseball and softball. What the Olympic Committee decided back in 2013 was that if a country has 2 sports that is popular in those countries, they can add them to the Olympic program if they're not already on the Olympic program. Hence, softball and baseball are very popular in Japan. So those were the 2 sports that were added to the program in Tokyo. So I would imagine that for the and so they will not be in Paris in 2024 because those sports are not popular in France, but they may come back in 2028 when the games come back to the United States. Then there was this is the first Olympics without a Michael Phelps or an Usain Bolt since 2000. So the stars and brands that we've come to know at each Olympics, when you turn on the games, they were largely absent, replaced by new stars. The storylines of Allison Felix, and then, of course, Simone Biles. Simone Biles, by far, dominated the first week of the Olympic Games because here it is. She was supposed to be the star. She was the one driving ratings. She was the one that enabled NBC to sell out its ad inventory around these games. She's just hugely popular because of the success she's had. So when she had to pull out of the Olympics for mental health reasons, it became a polarizing issue because there are those that said, well, was it really mental health or was it the fact that she was behind in her routines, if you will? So that discussion really dominated the conversation in Tokyo. And it brought attention to mental health. And it kind of took away from the fact that the U.S. women's gymnastics team in the all-around competition still won silver. So they were beaten by the Russian Olympic Committee team, but they still won silver, which was still a very solid result. So that conversation was quite interesting. And then, of course, in the pool, there were the performances of the Australians as predicted. The Australian women did very well, as did the British men with Adam Peaty. still when you're setting world records. And for the U.S., Caleb Dressel, 5 gold medals, goes back to, as the heir apparent, if you will, to Michael Phelps, though those comparisons are inevitably made. They're two different types of swimmers. So once the program moved to the stadium, there was the men's high jump was a very interesting event when the gold medal was shared by Qatar's Mutaz Barshim and the Italian Gianmarco Tamberi. And what makes that interesting is that they were both tied at the end of the competition, if you will, and now they raised the bar for a jump off. But instead of having a jump off, the Bashir asked the official if they could share the gold medal. And that's what they ended up doing. These are two besties. They've been competing against each other since they were in the junior ranks. And so this was a very, very tangible display of sportsmanship and Olympism, if you will.
I have a question about that, Idy. I remember that story and seeing it. Was this unusual, or was this at the discretion of the Olympic Committee, the officials? Because I thought that's fantastic. However, there are those that will say they should have competed until one of them was the winner.
Yeah, so this is a rule that the World Athletics, which governs the athletics. So the officials that oversee the events at the Olympics are from that sports federation. So not the Olympics per se, right? So the Olympics are the umbrella, and then each sport brings its own official, its own judges, and its own rules to competition. So the rules of World Athletics, when it comes to the high jump, really should be if they're tied at a certain point, then they now raise the bar by a certain amount, and then there's a jump off. But the rules also permit the sharing of the draw, if you will. So whether it was an Olympic Games or any other competition, World Athletics permits that if the athletes are tied and there's mutual agreement, then first place can be shared between the two athletes who qualify for the jump off. Now, it is unusual. I've not seen that before. There are those that say, you know what? They could, neither athlete was injured. They could have jumped to see who is actually the best. We go to the Olympics to see who's the best, not to, engage in, shared negotiations for a medal, if you will. So there are those that wanted to see a jump off. And also, one of those athletes had a legitimate shot at an Olympic record and a world record. But because they agreed to share the medal, that ended the competition. So you could not say that one athlete would continue and go for the world record, because if he now clears that bar, he wins the competition. So in some way, it muted the enthusiasm for the event to some people, because we were deprived of seeing these athletes that were easily clearing this height go for an Olympic or world record. Like in the case of the pole vault, the gentleman from Sweden absolutely took a shot at the Olympic record. And that's something that was absent in the high jump. So to answer the long answer to your question is yes, the sports governing body, which is World Athletics, permits the sharing of the top result if neither athlete wishes to continue. So it is very, very unusual.
A couple more questions. Allison Felix, tell us about her story.
Allison Felix first competed at the Olympics, I think it was in 2004 when she was 18. And so she is now a mom, and she had a very public split with Nike, which was her primary sponsor. When she was pregnant with her child, Nike, according to Felix, as she recounts, kind of withdrew elements of the sponsorship, was not using her in as many campaigns, and was not interested in renewing the agreement. And so she felt that she was being penalized because she was about to become a mom. So she started her own brand called Athleta, Athleta, and she returned to run at the Olympic Games under the Athleta brand. And so she ended up winning a bronze medal in the women's 400, which then tied her with Carl Lewis as the most decorated U.S. Olympian track athlete, not overall athlete, but track and field athlete. And then She competed in the women's 4x400 meter relay, which was won by the U.S., and that gave her her 11th Olympic medal, thereby making her the most decorated U.S. Olympian track athlete in history. And given those results, it is not likely that we have seen the last of Allison Felix. The World Championships of Track and Field will be held in Eugene, Oregon next year. And there is every possibility that Allison Felix will continue to compete all the way into Paris. And let me just point out a couple other things from athletics that was a storyline. Marcel Jacobs of Italy ends up winning the men's 100 meters out of nowhere. That was unexpected. Sydney McLaughlin sets a world record in the women of the U.S. sets a world record in the women's 400 meter hurdles. And then Kristen Warholm of Norway just destroys the world record in the men's 400 meter hurdles. So those were outstanding performances in track and field that perhaps came unexpectedly, if you will. In the case of Warholm, we expected him to win, but not to shatter the world record the way he demolished it like that.
Are the athletes continuing to get bigger, better, stronger, faster? That's probably a line from a $6 million man back from 1970s. Are they getting just that much better?
In some cases, yes. I mean, $6 million man, Colonel Steve Austin, a man barely alive. Yeah. I think in some cases, yes. For instance, in the men's 100 meters, the time of 9.80, the winning time of Marcel Jacobs, was well below what Usain Bolt ran in his 3 Olympic victories in 2008, 2012, and 2016. So there was a little bit of attrition there in that event. But we did see world records fall under very difficult circumstances. I do think that the training methods, the nutrition, the equipment is getting better. I mean, there a little bit of controversy with these shoes that Nike has come out with that say that it gives athletes an unfair advantage from previous years. But, well, the shoes are, in fact, legal. They're high-performance shoes. And so we can't say for sure if it's just the shoes in this case, but the equipment overall is getting better. Training methodologies are getting more sophisticated. We've seen the introduction of all kinds of technology, software to aid in everything from sleeping to counting calories to when you should train to muscle fatigue. I mean, so the regimens are becoming much more intense, if you will, and much more ubiquitous, right? Because, for instance, we would only see athletes from some of the wealthier countries able to afford to use some of these new methodologies. But now we're seeing these being perhaps a lot more pervasive. So a lot of the technologies that are available to first world countries are now also available to athletes that don't come from some of the wealthier nations. And that is closing the gap, if you will, in terms of some of the competitions and medals won from countries perhaps that in years past did not have the same level of training sophistication.
Idy, I host another series on Success Insight called Mindset Monday with Andre Martin. Andre is a golf professional. She's a coach. She's also a business coach in her own right. And we always talk about, quote unquote, mindset and how the athletes are training to be high performers in the world of golf. And in golf, she has shared that the athlete has, any number of coaches. I don't know the exact number, but you've got a short game coach, a drive coach, a putting coach, a nutritionist, an exercise coach. Are there athletes or there teams that are having all of that, as they prepare for these world-class events? And you kind of just, I think, answered the question in a way. A lot of that is while it was available to first world countries is now available to smaller markets. But are you seeing that more and more as the athletes are really honing in on this other area of what it means to be a high performer?
Yes, because of the amount of data that comes in and the way that the data is now interpreted. So everything a high performance athlete does primarily is there's data around it. So now when they look at the data, they are now able to make very scientific, very technical adjustments that perhaps in years past they would not have been able to make. So as a result, that event becomes much more competitive because other athletes are now having access to the data. Their data is now being entered and crunched into the system and being analyzed. And now with that, on the other side of that, though, we've seen increases in doping in countries that perhaps in years past you would not have seen doping, because now there are also better techniques to mask doping, and the illicit, let me say, the banned substances are also now becoming more available in these smaller countries that before they would be either unavailable or too expensive. But as some of these athletes are also having access to some of these doctors that have been associated perhaps with performance enhancing drugs and techniques, and they're having access to some of the agents that encourage these, because these agents represent the athletes, and the athlete's performance directly ties into the commission that an agent makes if the athlete wins. So if an athlete wins, say, a major marathon or a major event or something, that athlete is much more marketable, and so on and so forth. There's that multiplier effect that benefits the agent. So a lot of these agents now do go to some of these smaller countries and offer, if you will, some substances that they believe would enhance their marketability through high performance. And so that's the other side of perhaps the opening of the world, if you will, to technology and data and access, because it also provides the ability for the athletes to get things that perhaps they should not or would not have in years past. And because of the fact that you have agents involved, getting access to these substances is no longer a financial issue. They can now have access. So it does work both ways, because we did see a number of athletes banned from countries like Nigeria and Russia and Kenya, not to single out those countries, but we did see the Athletics Integrity Unit, for example, come back and return some positive results, whereby a lot of these athletes, having arrived Tokyo, were not allowed to compete, unfortunately, because of the positive test results.
Very good. I appreciate that insight. Now, I have kind of a gotcha question, and feel free to push back on me. I totally get it. You and I know each other well enough. And hey, for the folks who are listening on this episode, this is okay. There seems to be still some sexism when it comes to the Olympics and for, I guess, sports in general. What the male athletes wear versus the female athletes. And I know early on there were some rules that perhaps they were broken, and some team got docked because they refused to wear, the traditional quote unquote skimpy outfit in favor of a more one-piece outfit that was not still very functional for the athlete, but also not as revealing. Anything changing in this area, or is it still a guy's event beyond the athleticism?
Yeah, that's a very good point. A couple of things there. Gender equity and the way it's seen through the lens of sports has always been a challenge, because in a lot of cases, not to go in too deep into the weeds with this, but sport in general was not really, when the concept of sport, organized sport itself, which is not very old, it's probably been around for about 150 years or so. So relatively speaking, organized sport is not that old. The participation of women in sport has always been an issue that had to be perhaps controversially discussed, even in areas where it shouldn't be. Women were not allowed at the first Olympics in 1896 in Athens, Greece. They could only compete at the second Olympics in Paris in 1900. And even then, they were only restricted to two sports, golf and tennis, because of the stress involved. At the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, the swimming event was introduced for the first time. And I bring up 1912 in Stockholm because the U.S. team did not send a swim. The U.S. did not send a swim team to those Olympics. Why? Because the swim organizers expected women to wear swimsuits. The United States team at the time, which was run by the Amateur Athletic Union, said that its swimmers would only compete if they were able to wear dresses down to the ankles.
Oh my.
So you can imagine swimming in a dress down to the ankle. So as a result, the U.S. did not enter a team for the 1912 Olympics. Australia did, the United Kingdom did, the U.S. was absent. So this idea of clothing has always been an issue when it comes to gender reveal. So the incident you're referring to is Norway. The Norwegian beach handball team refused to wear bikinis because they felt that it was too sexually objectifying, if you will. So the International Handball Federation fined them. I believe it was a couple $100,000. And the singer Pink, I think that's a singer performing performance art, she stepped up and offered to pay the fine for them if in fact their appeal was unsuccessful. They said enough is enough, that they do not want to wear things to them, whereas the men don't have to wear those same kind of revealing outfits. So beach handball is not an Olympic sport yet, but that particular incident made headlines, and it was a publicly debated issue as to whether or not the same rules ought to apply to everyone, and why are there those types of rules at all? Primarily since what you wear in this case does not in any way affect the performance of the other team. If you feel that you are better prepared to win wearing shorts instead of a bikini, many people felt that they ought to have been allowed to do that. So depending on the sport federation, they set the rules, and there's a lot of people that have concerns about how these rules are applied to women. Gymnastics, for instance, women can only wear fingernail polish that is a certain color, either it's pink or it's clear. Your nails can only be a certain length. The outfit has to be a certain way. So again, in gymnastics, the German team decided that they were going to wear a different type of gymnastics outfit that concealed more skin than perhaps others, because again, they did not want to be objectified. So a lot of times these governing bodies, these international sport federations, have rules concerning what you can wear and what you can't wear. And a lot of people feel that there's still a long way to go with respect to sexism in those rules.
It would seem, from my vantage point, my lens, which is far removed from yours, but that topic of clothing, the objectification of women, and getting back to Simone Biles, the how we treat mental health are going to continue to be on the radar for a while, and it's going to continue to grow in awareness.
Yeah, you have ambassadors like Simone Biles who spoke out publicly about this. Used to be at the Olympic Games, you had to maintain the stiff upper lip. You could not talk about your emotions. It was a very adroitic type of experience, primarily driven by the Olympic platform itself. It was a platform to prosecute the Cold War. So in that sense, you had athletes used as proxies to fight the Cold War, largely Eastern Bloc countries led by Russia and East Germany versus the West, NATO, the United States, Canada. Okay. So in this case, athletes were not really allowed to show that much emotion. Certainly, if you were not mentally able to compete at peak levels, you were still expected to go out there and compete. And so a lot of attention is now being brought to the area of mental health for athletes and others, right? They speak out. If something doesn't feel right, don't compete. In the case of Simone Biles, she pointed out that she could have been seriously injured in one of her stunts because she does so many incredible things in the air that if she comes down the wrong way, that's instant paralysis. So she did not want to take that risk. And leading into the Olympics earlier this year, top-ranked tennis player Naomi Osaka withdrew from the French Open, citing mental health issues, and she was greatly criticized by not just French Open tennis officials, but others in the sport, saying, what do you mean you don't feel like competing? What do you mean that you can't go out there? So that's really when we started having this discussion. She ended up later withdrawing from Wimbledon, but her experience in that conversation with Wimbledon officials was much different. It was more clinical. It was more like, you know what, if you're not able to compete this year, that's fine. You've been a great ambassador for us. We'll see you next year. And that conversation kind of spilled over into the Olympics with the Simone Biles situation. So that's a topic that more and more athletes are feeling more comfortable and not as stigmatized to come out and talk about mental health. Whereas in years past, because of what the Olympics were, the platform they would shy away from such conversation. But now they're openly talking about it, and they feel it's okay to do so. And many agree with them.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that insight, Idy. Before we close down the episode today, what's new for you? What's on your horizon? There's obviously no shortage of world-class events. We still have COVID. I'm sure you're still keeping busy and working hard. What's in store for you?
A couple of things. One, looking forward to the 2022 Winter Olympic Games coming up in about 6 months. They start in February in Beijing, China. So with the cases of COVID, what they are, how will China handle its first ever Winter Olympic Games? And then Paris 2024. Those will be the Olympic program there is interesting because breakdancing will be introduced to the Olympic program, if you can believe that.
Oh my.
And breakdancing will be introduced to the Olympic program. And the Vatican will send an Olympic team for the first time ever. So that ought to be interesting, seeing the Vatican team come into the Olympic movement. And we've not seen that before.
Wow.
So and with the short Olympic cycle, I have been working on trying to reconnect and re-engage with clients. They've faced a whole lot of uncertainty during this sports season, starting back really in March of 2020. And some of these countries are still facing surges in COVID, but they're also trying to navigate it. So just trying to figure out how to add value. In a lot of cases, just kind of setting aside sport for a minute and asking, well, can I help you in other areas? Trying to insert our expertise where it is needed. But then also on content development, we want to push out more content across multiple platforms now. We feel that there's a lot out there such that we can tell a story, if you will, that has resonance with the general public now, and not just a niche audience in the area of sport. We can take a sport that has historical context or an event that has historical context and perhaps broaden the appeal of that event to a wider audience. So storytelling is an area that we're focusing on for the foreseeable future, beginning, quite frankly, in January, the end of January of 2022.
Very good. Very good. Idy, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Idy Sports. You can go to my website to figure out where we can add value to the things that you're working on, www.idsports.com, IDYSPORTS.com. And we are refreshing our YouTube channel as well. So our YouTube channel will also be Idy Sports. So the best way to get in touch with us would be the website. If you want to send me an email directly, you can do so at Idy, IDY, at IDYsports.com. So that's Idy at IDYSPORTS.com. And we usually try to answer right away.
Fantastic. Well, Idy, I think I warned you this could be a 20 to 30 minute podcast. We are well over 50 minutes. And it's just it's a good problem to have. I mean, good quality content, and truly appreciate, number one, our friendship that has grown over the years, but also you taking time out of your day to join us here on our podcast. And, we're branding alongside various series. And As I was getting ready to have you today, I'm thinking, where am I going to put Idy? Because we're going to talk about the Olympics and sports, but I think this fits very nicely under coaching and consulting insights, because that's exactly what you're doing for your clients. You're coaching and consulting them to succeed from a marketing perspective at these world-class events. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us.
Howard, you're most welcome. Let me just say this. I mean, we're definitely a friend to the program. I certainly appreciate not just your friendship, but your mentorship and the confidence you've had in us over the years to help us grow. You've been there to answer questions, provide tactical advice and insight. So your platform has been a very big part of our success. So I'm happy to come on here at any point in time. And I want to thank you, especially for the confidence you've had in our growth. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Idy Uyoe. He's an Olympic scholar and sports marketing specialist. Today, we were chatting about the 2020 Olympics, which were then held in 2021 in Tokyo, the Summer Olympics, and not only the challenges that the Olympic Committee and the country of Japan, the host committee, had in pulling off this event, and also the challenge that was faced from a marketing perspective, a coordination, logistics perspective. And then we also spent a fair amount of time, which I love, is Idy's perspective on some of the major happenings during the events, whether it was, the brands, mental health, the pool, the high jump, Allison Felix, Simone Biles. I mean, it's just a lot of cool information. So if sports marketing, if the Olympics, world-class sports are of interest to you, you definitely have to reach out and check out Idy and his work and visit him at idysports.com. We'll provide the backlink to it, as well as to the links to Idy's Twitter site and YouTube page. And really just a great way to spend, I don't know, we're going on over 50 minutes now with a good friend and somebody who, really he's an amazing guy. And just, this is like 6 degrees of separation to the Olympics, as I know somebody who knows somebody about the Olympics. So how about that? Folks, we hope you enjoyed today's podcast on coaching and consulting insights, the series on Success Insight Podcast. Do let us know by visiting our successinsightpodcast.com webpage. We are also on LinkedIn and Facebook. Comment on the episode, like it, share it, whatever you prefer, but we want to hear what's on your mind. Also, check us out on our podcasting platforms, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Pandora, Spotify, especially Spotify, because our Coaching and Consulting Insights series is available on Spotify, and this is where our episode with Idy is going to be located. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. Take care of yourselves, your family. Practice social distancing if it makes sense. Wear your mask if it makes sense. But above all, take care of yourself and your community. And we will see you on the next episode of the Coaching and Consulting Insight series on the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.